Welcome to the Government Art Collection. My name's Chantal Condron and I'm the Curator of Public Engagement here. And this evening I warmly welcome you to discover six of my favourite works from the collection, or as we call it, the GAC. First of all, many thanks to Art UK and to Bloomberg Philanthropies for inviting me to join Art Unlocked, which has been a really fantastic series of talks. A former UK arts minister once mentioned why art was shown in government buildings, saying that many people come into my office, people from all over the world, and what they're seeing is not my art. The Government Art Collection is an opportunity to showcase that art because the world's opinion formers every day of the week come into these offices, come into our embassies, and we're making a really bold statement about what we can do. Almost 125 years old, the GAC is a national accredited collection of art spanning the 16th to the 21st centuries. Artworks spend the majority of their time beyond one location. Approximately 2/3 are dispersed in the UK and internationally across 370 buildings and 129 countries. The GAC is a collection that also occupies the unusual position of sitting within a government department, the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. Artworks on display in museums and galleries engage and resonate with audiences in so many different ways. However, how does a work of art function, or what can it bring when it's shown in the working environments of government buildings? So this evening I've chosen 6 favourite works, which has been a tricky challenge, whittling them down from a collection of over 14,700. Each has its own absorbing narrative and history, but as we're looking at each one, I hope to reveal how they make bold and sometimes surprising statements in these government spaces. But before turning to these, I'm going to quickly introduce you to how the GAC began. Many art collections in the past have been formed to project status, either individual or national. The GAC's earliest years developed in a rather more parsimonious fashion. Here is a brief but significant item from our archive. A memo written in 1899 by Lord Esher at the Office of Works to Sir Francis Mowat, the head of the Treasury, who's the man you can see on the right. Esher proposed £150 to buy art that he said will save a good sum in decoration. So from a practical perspective, at first sight, it seems that the collection sprang from the need to cover up peeling wallpaper. However, Lord Esher's prudently frugal observation was the first evidence of conscious collecting by the GAC, which at first became known as the Government Picture Collection. A visitor to a British embassy in the early 1900s, such as the embassy in Paris, which you can see here, would more than likely have been met with a historical landscape or a portrait of a British king or queen. This photograph shows Luke Fylde's portrait of Edward VII, a large painting that, while definitely covering a great deal of wall space, also projected a sense of a particular history or tradition. And during the 20th century, the GAC gradually gained more funding from the Foreign Office. Ambassadors posted abroad began to write in to ask for more art. Why? Partly because they recognised the strategic cultural value of showing art in embassies, but fundamentally, these requests reflected a demographic shift of those who were starting to be appointed into government roles. Most people didn't have private art collections to show in their own buildings. So the collection became recognised as an important early mechanism of modern British diplomacy. And today art functions in a similar way in government spaces. In 2013, the UK hosted the GA Summit at Lough Erne in Northern Ireland. And for this international event, the GAC was asked to select artworks that highlighted links to Ireland for display in the main negotiating rooms. We chose works by artists including William Scott and Barry Cook, and in one of the main negotiating spaces, we installed Parlous Land, which is a set of lithographs you can see here behind the main table, from 2005 and 6 by Northern Irish artist Elizabeth McGill. Her hauntingly ethereal prints resonate with her memories of growing up on the coast of County Antrim. Sharing artworks and narratives in these places play a very specific role that goes beyond hiding the wallpaper. By making links between people, histories, and geographical locations, they have a uniquely subtle but powerful way of supporting diplomacy and representing the UK's past and present in working environments, from modern offices to historical interiors. In the 1950s and 60s, there was a shift from buying mainly historical to contemporary artworks, so that modern paintings, at least those made after 1900, began to outnumber historical paintings. So here is Prime Minister Harold Wilson in 1969, lighting up in his study at number 10 with one of his favourite works, Lancashire Fair, Good Friday Daisy Nook by L.S. Lowry, which the collection bought in 1947. Painted the year before, it shows a scene from the annual Easter Fair that's taken place in Fellsworth Country Park, Oldham, since the early 1900s. A recurring favourite of Prime Ministers, Lowry's painting replaced an 18th century portrait of the first Prime Minister, Sir Robert Walpole, by Jean-Baptiste Van Loo, which had previously hung in the study. And Marcia Williams, who became Lady Faulkner, who was Wilson's private secretary at the time, later reflected that Lowry's world is a world that Harold Wilson understands, knowing it both from his father's recollections and from his own vivid childhood memories. Shifts in collecting have been evident throughout the GAC's history, and as we'll discover very soon, two of the works in my talk were acquired recently in the context of the GAC's representation of the People Project. Launched in 2018, this is our 10-year commitment to champion greater representation in the collection across gender, race, sexuality, faith, disability, and social economic background. We began in 2018 by buying works solely by women. We did this to mark the centenary of the Representation of the People Act, which was an important piece of British legislation that for the first time gave some women aged 30 and above the right to vote. So let's turn to the first of my 6 works this evening. In 1949, 2 years after buying the Lowry painting, the Ministry of Works took a significant step in commissioning a contemporary British artist to create the first site-specific artworks for a government building. These were a series of 5 oil paintings by John Piper, one of which you can see here, which is called Brighton Regency Square. Piper's paintings were commissioned by the Ministry of Works for the newly built British Embassy in Rio de Janeiro, then the capital of Brazil. The new building had been designed in a neoclassical style, which at the time was criticised for not presenting Britain as a modern post-war nation. The Piper's paintings were commissioned specifically for 5 large wall recesses in the dining room in the embassy. And rather than buy 5 separate historical paintings, which would have been beyond the GAC's annual budget, Richard Walker, a part-time art advisor at the time to the ministry, proposed to commission a living artist to make new paintings, what turned out to be canny and economical move, as the commission came to a fee of about 100 guineas. Presenting 5 views of British bar towns, 2 each of Bath and Cheltenham and 1 of Brighton, Piper's paintings are deeply romanticised city scenes, dramatic in scale like theatrical backdrops, as if waiting for characters to step into their deep, shadowy recesses. They echo the empty city squares and the arcades painted by the early 20th century Italian artist Giorgio de Chirico. Piper once remarked that romantic painting is about the particular, not the general. And when he painted these works in 1949, his reputation was firmly established through a versatile body of work in painting, printmaking, graphic arts, textiles, stained glass, and set design. Having experimented with abstraction during the 1930s, by the end of that decade, he returned to painting in a modern romantic style, at a time when England's architectural heritage was under threat. And as official war artist, he continued to record romanticised views of Britain's bombed buildings and cities. In his paintings for Rio, Piper chose exact streets and corners that bookmarked his own memories of visiting each town. But as a commission, they resonated with the architecture of the building they were destined for. In 1960, the city of Brasilia became the new capital of Brazil. However, the British Embassy didn't relocate fully until 1973. And 3 years later, a decision was made to split up the paintings and display them in new locations. All 5 were reunited in 2011 for the first time for the GAC's major touring exhibition that opened at the Whitechapel Gallery. And today they remain together on display in the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office in London, the first time they've been shown together in a government building since the 1940s. The GAC still plays an important commissioning role today, often in collaboration with other government departments. Over the past 20 years, we've delivered major art projects for the British embassies in Berlin and Moscow and for the Home Office. And in 2012, we commissioned a new work by Mel Broomfield for the GAC's exhibition at the Whitechapel during the London 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games. Now, my next artwork is one of the smallest paintings in the collection, and it's measuring in at just over 42 by 33 centimetres, but it's rich in mystery. Historically, it's significant as it's the earliest work of art by a woman in the collection. As shimmery as a pearl, portrait of a lady wearing an oyster satin dress was painted by Joan Carlyle in the 1650s. Born Joan or Joanna Palmer around 1606, Carlyle became one of the first professional female portraitists in England, a contemporary of the more widely acknowledged artist Mary Beale. Ongoing research of Carlyle's work has observed that many of her paintings share compositional similarities and stylistic traits, such as the silvery highlighting of facial features and the hanging curls of her female sitter's hair. In 1637, Carlyle moved to Petersham Lodge in southwest London, where her poet husband Lodovick Carlyle was appointed the keeper of Richmond Park. This painting from Lamport Hall in Northamptonshire is believed to depict the Carlyle family, and the woman in the hat at the very far left is thought to be the only known self-portrait of Carlyle. And this is where the mystery lies. At Petersham, Carlyle's paths crossed with Elizabeth Murray, Countess of Dysart, who research suggests may be the woman in the GAC's portrait, and who Carlyle is known to have painted several times. Living at Ham House in Richmond, Murray was a loyal supporter of Charles I and an astute political operator who protected her position by maintaining relations with opposing political forces. In 1653, she joined the Sealed Knot, a secret organisation established to restore Charles to the throne. After the Restoration, her loyalty was recognised with an annual life pension of £800, and she was a keen collector and patron of Carlyle. From 1654 up to her death in 1679, Carlyle moved between Petersham and Covent Garden, which was then the centre of London's thriving artistic community, where she continued to undertake successful commissions. The GAC's acquisition of her portrait in 2018 was perfectly appropriate, coming into the collection that year that we acquired works owned by women. And since then, the portrait has been shown in our exhibition, taking up space, and this summer, it was installed in the State Drawing Room at 11 Downing Street, part of a new display of historical to contemporary works, including some you can see here by Joan Erdley, Jessica Dismore, and Peter Tillmans. Mentioned in this month's art newspaper, this eclectic salon-style display is described as a room with plenty of works to spark off conversations. Exploring 5 centuries of British art and society, it contrasts historical portraits of former chancellors Henry Pelham and Pitt the Younger with paintings by notable female artists from Vanessa Bell to contemporary artist Flora Jukhanovic. Sparking conversations and encouraging dialogue are essential ingredients for maintaining diplomatic relationships between the UK and the world. Selecting works for embassies and consulates means that the GAC is always on the lookout for works that connect aspects of British history, life, or art with those of another country. And one of the most vivid examples of this is Reflection, which is an oil on linen painting of 1982 by Bridget Riley, one of Britain's leading artists whose work is recognised around the world. Here's a photograph of a state room at the British Embassy in Cairo, where diplomatic meetings and conversations often take place. Why, you may wonder, did the GAC acquire Riley's paintings specifically for this embassy? In late 1979, Riley visited Egypt for the first time, and during her visits to the tombs of the kings in the Nile Valley and the museum collections in Cairo, she was struck by the vibrancy of a particular set of colours. This fragment of a tomb painting from 1350 BC in the British Museum gives you a sense of these colours. Riley noticed that these certain set of colours had been used recurrently in tombs and on objects for over 3,000 years, each one with symbolic affinities linking the world of the living with the afterlife. Discovering the use of these colours made a great impression on Riley. After returning to her studio, she began experimenting with them in her characteristic stripe paintings, recalling from memory the colours that she called her Egyptian palette. And as she observed shortly after painting Reflection in 1982, she said, "It had always been my practice to fix my palette. The ancient Egyptians recast their chosen colours over and over again in various media and for all formal or state purposes. I adopted this ancient palette, recreating the colours from memory. Reflection is one of the first paintings I made with it." For the next 5 years, Riley continued to experiment with the Egyptian palette, and this period marked a transitional moment in her practice, occurring at the same time that she shifted from painting in acrylic and synthetic colours to oil, a medium that allowed her to explore the spatial qualities and depths of colour. Experimenting with the effects of perception in Riley's work is less about creating optical illusions than creating forms that allow us to experience an emotion or a mood. Playing with repetition, contrast, and counterpoint in her work, Riley creates visual disturbances that make sensory connections between painting and audience. So in 1999, Reflection was installed in the same room at the Cairo embassy, since when it's been displayed there almost permanently. The GAC is often described as a working collection, and Reflection plays a unique ambassadorial role in Cairo, just as Sir Geoffrey Adams, the British ambassador to Egypt from 2018 to 21, has described when he said, "I make this point to the thousands of visitors we have every year. It's central to my mission as ambassador, but it's having these fantastic works of art at hand to illustrate the point quite literally. That gives it real impact. I suspect that the art will remain in our guests' memories long after my words have faded." Now you can see there's a rather elaborate chair in that picture, and which is bringing me to the subject of chairs. And you may have noticed that several of them have cropped up in some of my images this evening. But when is a chair an artwork and an artwork a chair? Lisa Meitner is a work by Yelena Popova, a Russian-born artist who's now based in the UK. And so far, this is the first artwork in the GAC that began its life as a chair. It's currently on display at the Cabinet Office. Popova's work was bought along with her digitally created tapestry, One Neutron Too Many, which is composed of multiple rays and waves that ripple from its central circles. These are based on diagrams of low-level uranium used in nuclear fuel and highly radioactive plutonium used in nuclear weapons. Both elements differ by just one neutron, a minute disparity that has major potential consequences for humanity. Popova made both of these works in 2018 after completing a year-long residency at Girton College, Cambridge, which was founded in 1869 as the first women's college in Britain. And while there, she researched the history of scientists connected to the early development of nuclear fission. And there, she discovered the pioneering achievements of Austrian-Swedish physicist Lisa Meitner. Born in Vienna in 1878, Meitner later moved to Berlin to pursue her career. And in 1926, she became the first woman in Germany to achieve the position of Professor of Physics. Meitner and fellow physicist Otto Hahn led the research group that would eventually discover nuclear fission of uranium, arguably the most controversial scientific breakthrough of the 20th century. As a female scientist working in Germany in the 1930s, Meitner's career suffered from discrimination. She had been born into a Jewish family, but despite having later converted to Christianity, when the Anschluss took place in Germany in March 1938, she was left unemployed and under threat. Escaping first to the Netherlands, she eventually settled in Sweden. In 1942, she was invited to join the influential Manhattan Project, an American-Canadian initiative that led to the first formation of the atomic bomb. However, by then, acutely aware of the horror of war and a strident pacifist, Meitner responded, "I will have nothing to do with the bomb." Her decision resonated loudly for Popova, an artist born in what was known as a closed town near the Ural Mountains, part of a secret network of places built around the former Soviet Union during the Cold War to maintain nuclear energy and defense. And as Popova explains, I thought if it was a woman instead of a man that had made the whole history of nuclear development, if a woman had also made decisions around nuclear power, those decisions would have been very different. And in celebration of Meitner's discovery and ultimately her pacifism, Popova used a version of an earlier tapestry to upholster the chair, which was retrieved from Girton College. And dedicating it to Meitner, she observed how, quote, "I like to visualize Meitner sitting in the chair and taking a moment to reflect on her complex historical legacy." Popova's work, like the Joan Carlyle portrait, was acquired in 2018 to mark the centenary of the Representation of the People's Act, and it marked the start of the GAC's representation project. And this project has continued to shape how new works enter the collection. Every year, the GAC identifies potential new works by visiting artist studios, galleries, or exhibitions. However, in 2020, as the world shut down in response to the pandemic, the GAC changed direction swiftly and followed a different path to make sure new works continued to join the collection. And this developed into what was called the Art Cross UK project. Our curatorial team reached out to all of the contemporary art networks across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, asking each to propose artist work. And shortlisting from these, the GAC then held over 45 online studio visits with artists in a month. And over 90 new works came into the collection, the majority of which were by artists whose backgrounds and identities reflect the diversity of experience across the UK. And one of the artists I met with my colleagues was Jamie Crew, from whom we acquired 5 works from their series Slabs by Radcliffe Hall. Crew produced the Slabs for 2 solo exhibitions at Grand Union in Birmingham and Humber Street Gallery in Hull earlier in 2020. All of the works in the Slab series are inspired by The Well of Loneliness, the iconic semi-autobiographical novel written in 1928 by the English lesbian poet and writer Radcliffe Hall. The novel follows the life of its aristocratic protagonist, Stephen Gordon, a woman given a male name by a father desperate for a son. She's described by Hall as an invert, a derogatory term used in scientific literature at the time, to describe a person born with male desire within a woman's body. And in her novel, Hall describes Stephen as grotesque and splendid, conceived in a turbulent period of transition. Banned shortly after publication, The Well of Loneliness is a pioneering novel that Hall wrote with the clear intention of provoking public discussion of female same-sex desire in an era of prurient social discrimination and denial. It's left an enduring impression on generations of LGBTQIA+ readers, including Crew, a transgender artist whose practice embraces multiple art forms of installation, film, music, and performance. Their work disrupts contemporary perceptions of gender and trans issues, often exploring experiences through the lens of trauma or horror. Crew produced the Slabs in collaboration with a group of artists, writers, and family members, a process which is captured in their video Morton, Beadles, and Abyss, which was shown alongside the Slabs. The group enacted the 19th century craft of well dressing, a summertime activity that Crew did as a child growing up in the Peak District. Well dressing involves making designs from fresh flowers, seeds, wool, and other natural materials that are pressed into pallets of clay. Traditionally, well dressings are placed around village wells for a couple of weeks, after which they're taken down and destroyed, while the clay and the boards are kept to reuse. However, in what Crew calls their bastardized version, the design was cut into sections, fired in a kiln, fixing these otherwise ephemeral objects. Losing their colour and becoming cracked or bleached, the dressings were transformed into beautiful, permanent objects. And when first exhibited, Crew split up the complete set of slabs across 2 separate spaces, an intentional act to leave the work incomplete. And as they have described the work, quote, "Together and apart, the slabs test the possibility of living with a wound. In all of them, a chemical change had taken place and had been an ordeal. Beautiful things were burnt up and much was lost, but the objects have taken forms in which they might survive, changed." And Crew Slabs are currently part of the British Art Show 9 touring exhibition, which will open at its 2nd venue at Wolverhampton Art Gallery next month. So I recommend you all go and visit them. And this brings me To my last work this evening, which is a painting called Displacement, painted in 2017 by Sami. Displacement has an air of faintly absurd pathos. Zooming into a corner of a room, it shows a standard European 2-pin electrical plug lying redundantly beside a British standard 3-hole socket. This room feels like a newly occupied space, hurriedly decorated, with splashes of paint left messily around the socket and over the skirting. At first sight, it captures that feeling of irritation recognizable to anyone who's ever traveled to another country and realized they've forgotten to pack the right adapter. However, underlying this contemporary still life is a powerful narrative of personal trauma experienced and witnessed by Sami. Sami was born in Baghdad and as a talented young artist won several national art competitions before studying fine art in 2005. By the time he sought asylum in Sweden in 2007, the same country that Lisa Meitner had also sought sanctuary in the 30s, Sami had lived through 7 wars in Iraq. It was at this point on arrival in Europe that he describes as the start of his displacement. He painted this work a year after he had begun studying for a BA in fine art at Ulster University in Belfast. And despite no longer living in his home country, Sami continued to witness disturbing events from a distance. Dealing with the pain and the lived experience of post-traumatic stress disorder, his paintings express the changing emotions of loss, guilt, pain, and isolation. And he has said, "These autobiographical paintings record a vivid process of remembering. No memories are represented explicitly, but the condition of remembering is present. There's no intention to show evidence or record loss or death, but there is a burden of remembering." Sami approaches this burden of remembering through the use of motifs and subjects that draw upon semiotics to express meaning. Recognizably ordinary objects, the plug and the socket, are types of signifiers that communicate something beyond language. In this painting, they act as tragicomic puns that represent their eternal disconnection. Sami takes inspiration from classical and modern Arabic poetry and literature, in which puns are often used as literary devices to enrich a narrative. One writer whose work he often returns to is Mahmoud Darwish, the Palestinian poet and writer who frequently observed his homeland as a metaphor for the pain and loss of exile. And on the objects in Displacement, Sami's commented, "I move from depicting the visible to the invisible. You have to paint something that doesn't exist. Paint the smoke and that signifies fire. I talk about personal and accessible things, like how I use earplugs to sleep at night, and how when I came from Sweden, my plug didn't fit the British socket." Sami's painting was recently part of a display called the Show Windows Reflections, an Historic England initiative during Coventry City of Culture. For this month-long project, the GAC loaned 7 artists' works, which were installed in shop windows in the city's post-war shopping centre. Each one was selected in collaboration with the community interest company Quiet Down There and with Carriers of Hope, a charity that supports refugees, migrant and asylum seekers in the region. Accompanying Displacement on display in Coventry was a description of Sami's painting as a reflection on the often hidden trauma in society, to empathise and to consider the histories of others. Representing the complex multiple histories and narratives of Britain at home and abroad is at the heart of the GAC. It's a collection of artworks that, while acknowledging the people, places and events of the past, has a firm footing and a responsibility to reflect those of the present and the future. It's been a real pleasure to share some of my favourite works with you this evening, and I hope they've provided a window into this very unusual collection. So without any further ado, I don't think I've said thank you, and I must say thank you again to Art UK and to Bloomberg Philanthropies for supporting this evening, and thank you to everyone for watching.